Welcome to the second lecture of this spring 2023 semester. I'm pleased and honored to have a close friend of mine, Luca Molá, Professor Luca Molá, who is a professor of history at the University of Warwick in England, and who has served for 8 years at the European University Institute in the chair of modern history. So Luca has an extensive quantity of publications on the field. He is more or less an early modernist or a Renaissance historian. We had the chance of meeting each other a few years ago in occasion of the fact that our masters were very close friends, Humphrey Butters and Richard Galtwaith. Luca has written about mostly the silk industry in Venice, but also in Lucca. Let me quote one of among the many publications he has done on the silk industry in Venice, published by Johns Hopkins University in the year 2000, and many others. He has been involved in many publications, and in one of the series of Il Rinascimento e l'Europa, the Renaissance and Europe, and then he embarked on a new research on patents in the Renaissance, which is a very interesting kind of topic. Tonight, he will give a lecture on the Italian Renaissance and the labor material culture. Thank you very much, Luca.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Good. Thank you for coming, and this, you must come probably, I don't know if you are compelled, but late in the day, and I'm an economic social historian. Late medieval Renaissance, I do more or less 14th to 17th century. And what I'm going to present today, I know that you are not historians, and you are not art historians, right? Most of you at least. So you're doing sciences, you're doing different things. So I hope it won't be too difficult to follow, but I don't think so. I'll try to present you, I don't know, what do you know about the Renaissance? Did you have any study or preparation before coming to Florence? Some of you. But you've been around. How long have you been in Florence so far? Okay, so yeah, we are at the beginning of April, so you have a knowledge of the city. You've been traveling in Italy probably, and okay. I'll talk a lot about Venice because apart that I'm Venetian, I've been working a lot on the history of Venice, but I've been working also on Florence, other parts of Italy, and Europe in general. You can see here, somebody recognizes this painting, which is in Santa Maria Novella. It's Masaccio, famous Florentine painter, and it's one of the first full examples of perspective. So how you can replicate a three-dimensional space in a flat, two-dimensional wall. This is a fresco that you find in the church, and you can see the depth that is created through this new geometrical technique that is invented in Florence in the early 15th century. When we talk about the Renaissance, there are different opinions. Here, from the artistic point of view, this is really the beginning. We are at the start of a revolution of, representing reality as the eye would see it in real life, not just as they did, artists did in the late Middle Ages. And it started in Florence. There's a long story about that. Other example of classical, Renaissance painting, Botticelli, Sandro Botticelli, the spring, la primavera. The first one is more religious. This is not pagan because Botticelli was very religious, but you can see a representation of sort of goddess of spring. Another example, again using perspective, by Perugino, another artist, not Florentine, this one, and you can see the perspective creating an ideal space of a square with this Jesus handing the keys of heaven to Saint Peter. I'm not giving you a talk on art history, but I have to say that in many cases, since the 19th century, the Renaissance has been thought as either an artistic or a literary moment in the history of Italy and then more widely in the history of Europe. It started in Italy in the early 15th century with the recovery of ancient culture. So the Italians, who had been in decline for a long time, looked at the ruins of the Roman Empire around them in the different cities in Italy. Have you been to Rome? Have you seen the Pantheon? Have you seen the big Pantheon in the square? The people in the 14th century looked at the Pantheon, the big dome, and they couldn't understand how technically it could have been made without beams sustaining the dome in the center. So there was like a fascination with antiquity and a movement to recover the culture of the ancients. For a long time, this has been considered the center of the Renaissance. I did my PhD at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore many years ago. It was in the 1990s. And I was the teaching assistant of a very good medieval professor. And I remember the textbook that we were using. And there was a last chapter on the Renaissance. And it says more or less, bunch of perverts having a lot of parties and some good art anyway. So the Renaissance is considered limited to the sphere of art and culture. It's not encompassing, is not involving other parts of society in Italy or in Europe. It's known that from Italy, by the late 15th century, this movement of the recovery of the classics moved to France, to Spain, and then to Northern Europe. So much so that if you took a person of the upper classes in the 19th century, early 20th century, they would have more or less the same knowledge of Latin, of Greek, of classical culture throughout Europe. So it's a movement that lasted over time. In terms of architecture, there's the famous architecture of a great architect of the late 16th century, Palladio, that you still find in the States. Is the Capitol building, so it's in many buildings in the States built in the 19th and 20th century. What I would like to talk about is a different view of the Renaissance that was presented by my supervisor at the time, an American professor, Richard Goldthwait, that in 1994 published a very influential book that you see on the left, Wealth and the Demand for Art in Italy, 1300, 1600. And he said, well, how come the Italians were spending so much in paintings, in churches, in palaces? You can see around Florence, many palaces were built in the 15th and 16th centuries. And how come that if you look at their houses, the inventories that we have, they accumulate more and more objects. They want to have luxury things in their houses. If you look at an inventory of the 14th century, a palace is almost empty. There's a big rooms with just the chairs, a few tables. If you look at the 16th century, the wardrobe of a noble lady or man of Florence has 100 or 200 pieces of garments and very rich. So there's an idea, according to Goldthwait, that the Renaissance is not just about art. It's about the beginning of consumerism. It's just the first, stirrings, as he says, but it will develop in France and in England in the 17th, 18th century, bringing to our contemporary society, which is based very much on consuming, buying objects and producing objects for, a mass market. In this case, it's more in the Renaissance, it's more for the elites and for the upper classes that could afford. Year 2000, there was another important book, The Material Renaissance, that came out of a research project that I was part of for 3 years with art historians working together with economic historians. So the two things together were actually very fruitful, and we started to look at what is called material culture. I don't know if you understand what it's meant by material culture. In America, it has a slightly different impression or meaning. Okay, can you tell anybody about what is material culture?
I can give a good yes.
Sorry?
I could give a good educated yes.
Okay, yeah, sure. No, I don't want a definition of a dictionary. No, please.
Wait, did you say material culture?
Mm-hmm.
I would guess it's just the material items of a culture rather than the ideals. So the stuff, the physical
objects, the things that are around us, especially those made by men, by people, not natural objects like trees or things that are made and that are important culturally for us, but also socially, because you understand or you create a relation by how you dress, by the things you buy, by the things you own. And this is the study that developed since 2000 in many parts of Europe, but starting really in England. There was a great interest in England. So putting together economic historians looking at production, consumption, exchange, how merchants were advertising their wares, for instance, was very interesting and very, as I said, very fruitful. What I'm going to talk about today, because this will be, especially in the first part, a global side, and I've already spent 10 minutes, so I must be quicker, but just to introduce the topic, I'll touch upon three things. The first is what we think as the Renaissance being just Italian, looking to the ancient classical culture of the Romans, it's actually much more contaminated, which is not a good word, but certainly mixed with influences coming from Asia or from other continents. And I will show you some examples of that. The second point is the importance of the state and the initiative of the state in Italy for innovation. Innovation is one of the keys of my research in many ways. How, why a society is innovating in terms of material culture, not talking about philosophy or other aspects that are just cultural. The third part, it will be about patents, because the Renaissance in Italy, and especially Venice, but also Florence, is where for the first time in the history of humanity, the intellectual property rights of single people are recognized by the government and given protection. You know what a patent is, right? Patent is, you know, you present an invention, an idea, or something that is feasible, that is doable, and you get a protection for a certain number of years that you have the monopoly of using this idea or selling the license for that. Anyway, let's start with some examples. I have to say, I'm looking at this global side because apart from the fact that it's quite important in the historiographical field, if there is one thing I'm very proud of my career is having started the first module, the first course on global history in Europe. That was already going on in the States, especially in California. There was a school of historians working for the first time to not just looking at Europe and the Western world, but looking at the interactions between different parts of the world. With two colleagues, a sinologist and an early modern historian, we started this module in Warwick that brought to the creation of a global culture and history center. Anyway, have you ever been to Lucca, which is not far from Florence? It's just an hour and 20 minutes if you take a train. This is a beautiful city, still with the medieval walls, early modern walls, and the medieval Renaissance structure. Not particularly big, but believe it or not, this was the center for the silk industry in Europe in the late Middle Ages. For reasons that we don't know clearly, all the silks, you look at any painting of the Renaissance and you will see these people mostly dressed in beautiful silks. Very expensive. Now you don't use silk. I think nobody is wearing anything made of silk, but it was the top of the top in the Renaissance. Rich people, not just monarchs, but princes, the Medici, everybody who had money wanted to have a silk cloth. The Lucchese, since the Italians by the late 13th century, for the first time were able to travel, Venetians and Genoese particularly, all the way to China, and there was a community of Italian merchants in China, they brought back a lot of the silks that were made in China. The Lucchese were able to copy exactly the textiles that arrived from China. This is made in Lucca in the late 13th century, but with a design and animals that are exactly from Central Asia and China. And they were able to replicate and make innovative textiles for Europe just by having this influence, this inspiration from China. And And you can see in many paintings these silk cloths that actually at the beginning were modeled on an Asian textile, on an Asian product. Another thing that came from Asia in the late Middle Ages is a color that is commonly known today, crimson. Okay, you know what is crimson, or you have an idea about what is crimson. Crimson, nobody was able in Europe to dye textile in crimson. It was a secret that was kept in Asia, and the only people close to Europe that knew how to dye with crimson were Armenian artisans and technicians. Here you can see some painting. This is from Bruges, no, from Ghent, I think is the Bavo altarpiece from the Low Countries. You can see the red that you see is crimson, and you can have other examples of crimson garments. It was the most expensive and the most popular color. Now, until late, these are a couple of little animals, insects. For most of the Middle Ages, people would dye in red with the couple on the left, which grows around the Mediterranean. It was known, and the Italians and everybody else knew how to dye textiles with that. The second is the insect that you dry, you crush, and you make into a paste, and you make the dye for making crimson. It's the most valuable, fast, and brilliant color. Nobody knew how to do it. At this point, I'm showing you a document, so you see what we work with when we work on the late Middle Ages. First of all, it's not easy to understand the handwriting. Second, it's in Latin. Third, it's partly, deleted by time. It's on parchment. So you need a fluorescent lamp to read it. But I can summarize the text. This is a dyer who presents himself to the Venetian government in 1393. And he says, I'm a dyer in the old type of dye, grana, and always wanted to know how to dye in crimson. So in order to learn that, I sent my son all the way to Constantinople, at the time still part of the capital of the Byzantine Empire, to find and learn the art and the way of making this color. My son wrote me from Constantinople, think about, we are in the late 14th century, that he didn't find anybody who knew how to dye in crimson. So he went all the way to the Black Sea, but he didn't find anybody again, and he went 1,000 kilometers, 700 miles from there, and finally he found the secret of dyeing in crimson, which means that he went either to Persia or to Armenia. Again, this is a case in which a young European goes all the way to learn a new technique in Asia, comes back, and it starts to become the most important color in Europe. So far that until the late 14th century, Europe imported textiles from Asia. All the silks, the best silks, apart from the ones from Luca and a few other centers, were imported. By the early 15th century, just 10 years later, they start exporting to Asia their own production. So it's an inversion of the tendency. It's a big innovation. Here is an image of the Black Sea. So he went probably to Armenia, Azerbaijan, or south to Persia. A lot of innovation came and were found in Venice because of the relationship between the Venetian state and the Ottoman Empire. I don't know what you know about Venice. Have you been to the city? Okay. It looks small, right? It was the biggest European center in the late Middle Ages, still in the 16th century, in terms of extension and population. It was almost 200,000 people, as big as Paris at the time, and twice the size of London in terms of population still in the late 16th century. But it remained as a city-state with possessions scattered in the Mediterranean. They had a bit of land in the north of Europe, then what is today the coast of Croatia. They had some parts of the island in Greece and Albania, Crete and Cyprus. This is the moment, the big top. By the middle of the 15th century, the Ottoman Turks conquered most of the Balkans and also Constantinople. So there was a tense relationship between Venice and this new empire. Venice, at the end, is not a big state. Very big, strong navy, and very rich merchants, so they have a lot of money to pay for the army and to pay for the fleet. But this is the Ottoman Empire in the 16th century. I don't know if you can make a relation, but it's a giant as compared to Venice. It stretches across 3 continents, Europe, Asia, and Africa. So there's no match. What the Venetians had to do is to keep quiet as much as possible the Ottomans. And they did so, making a lot of gifts, diplomatic gifts. I'll show you an image of the court of the Ottoman Empire. Now, we don't have a lot of pictures for the 16th century of the Ottoman Empire or the Ottoman court. There's a very famous in Turkey and in the Balkans TV series called The Magnificent Century. If you want to see it, there's online, or in YouTube, I think, you can find the whole series with subtitles in English. It's in Turkish, so you wouldn't, I mean, I don't know, but I couldn't understand a single. In Italian, when you don't understand the language, you say, parli turco, so I speak in Turkish, because really we cannot guess anything from Turkish. In any case, 139 episodes, so it's a long story, is the story of the life of Suleiman the Magnificent, the most important sultan of the 16th century, 1520, 1560s, that was in power. And you can see all these people are dressing in silk, by the way, if you don't recognize the material. And again, this is the court of Suleiman. This is one of the many, many pages listing all the gifts that every year, every 2 years, the Venetians sent to the Ottomans, silks, glass, all types of luxury materials. You might know that Venice is still famous for the making of glass that is made in the island of Mola. The problem with the Ottomans is that every member of the court asked the Venetians for new things. They wanted to have new objects that had never been made before. They wanted types of lamps of different shapes for the mosques, made in a shape that the Venetians had never done before, and the Venetians tried to satisfy their wishes. They tried to make glass, in different shapes. For instance, you have that glass on the left. Try to drink with that. It's not easy, but you must be very elegant when you use it. So it's very good for people at court. At some point, there was the wife of a vizier in Istanbul that asked the Venetians, "You should make me as a gift the biggest mirror ever made." You have to think that still in the late 16th century, there was no technical possibility of making a mirror in glass in which you could see yourself entirely. Mirrors were small. So there was a public competition launched by the government to find the artisan that could make the greatest mirror ever made. Then the Venetians invented different types. This is a glass with white canes inside. It was invented in the 1520s with a patent. I will talk about patents later. And it was invented by a man who was the son of the Venetian ambassador in Constantinople. I call it Istanbul if you want, but Istanbul is a name that the city takes only in the 19th century, even after a long time of domination by the Turks. It's interesting because he was so fond of the Ottoman culture and the Arab culture, but also of the classical style. He was a friend of some of the best architects in Italy, that he decided to create this palace that you see, strange palace for Venice, with one window with a classical arch and one window in what is like an Arab arch, one and one. So he alternated just to make this statement. He was also responsible for making some of the most incredible objects ever made in the Renaissance. This is Venice. This is, if you cross the Rialto Bridge, here you are in the Rialto Bridge and you're looking towards the market. The whole street on the left was the street where the jewelers were. And Venice was famous for the jewel that they made. And this is what was created in 1532 in order to be sold to Suleiman the Magnificent. It's a crown with 4 tiers, one more than the one worn by the Pope. The Venetian merchants were made for the Ottoman, and they were able to sell it to Suleiman the Magnificent. The people involved, it's quite interesting. It was the son of the Doge, who was one of the most important people at the Ottoman court. This is again from the TV series. It was the Grand Vizier of the Ottoman Empire. So it was a Turkish-Italian creation. This is the list of emerald, rubies, diamonds, pearls that were used to make this crown. The total, and I'll give you an example of what it means, it's almost 150,000 ducats. And ducats are the gold coin of Venice. Just to give you an example, this is one of the most beautiful palaces on the Grand Canal, the Cadoro, that in the past was really gilded and painted in blue and gold. Cost for building it 7,000 ducats. So you have to imagine one crown that is how many times? 70, it's 20 times at least this palace. With the same price, you could keep an army in the field for several months. So you can imagine the importance. Sometimes these products made for the Ottomans backfired. This is the case. I'll be very quick. I'm not reading everything, but we are in the 1590s. The mother of the Sultan, that is a very powerful person, and the greatest friend of the Venetians, diplomatically, says, new things have come in the market in Constantinople, some objects that look like feathers by birds. They were used in the Ottoman Empire, but they are made of glass, and you didn't make a gift of them to us at the harem, to me as the mother of the Sultan, so I just want you to stop producing and selling them. And the Venetians had to discuss, and this is the product that you can see in an image. It's like a feather made of very thin pieces of glass that was invented by the Venetians just to satisfy the Ottoman market. And this is the image of the mother of the Sultan as is represented in the TV series. I finished this section on contamination because I have to think that all these requests by the Ottomans were met through sending messages, sending letters to the Venetian ambassador that had to translate the requests from Turkish into Italian, send them to Venice. The government would find the right artisan who had to say, we cannot do this with our looms, we cannot do that with our implements. Then it was retranslated, the reply of the artisans. It went back to Constantinople. It can take 4 years, 5 years to make it the object that they wanted. But it's what I could call a cross-cultural production of luxury objects over time and at the distance of different continents. This piece is what I call the global object, not so much on the point of view of the connection of different people in the production, but the materials that were employed. This is a velvet in 2/8. You see the red, it's crimson, it's velvet, with gold thread. Now, it's worn out by time. It's a piece that is kept in a collection, but you can see that there are the gold threads. They are very visible. This is from the middle of the 16th century. The color is not the color that you have seen before. It's still crimson, but it doesn't come from the same insect that you have seen at the beginning. It comes from a cactus that was growing in Mexico, and it's a new thing found by the Spanish colonizers of Northern America in the 1530s. So they found that the Native Americans, the Mexicans, were using this dye that was like the crimson they had, but much cheaper and much better. So in Italy started to arrive this new color with which that textile is dyed. The silk that was used, these are an explosion, but if you look, have you ever seen a cocoon from which silk is made? It's this size, more or less. It's not very big. Came from 2 different parts of Asia. And I know that from looking at account books of producers. It came from Persia, from Isfahan and Tabriz, and from Syria. This is an image of the fort of Aleppo. That is probably, I don't know the situation at the moment, but Syria has been damaged, and Aleppo was at the center of the war in Syria for a long time. What about the gold? The gold was made by melting Venetian coins that were almost pure gold. This is a ducat. And the gold came still in the 16th century from sub-Saharan Africa, being collected in the center at Timbuktu. So you have a dye that comes from Mexico. You have silk that comes from Asia. You have gold that comes from Africa. And you have all these materials assembled by Italian artisans in Venice with patterns that are Renaissance, but had been mutated and imitated from Chinese and Asian models since the 14th century. This is what I call, can be, you know, a global object in a sense, the possibility of putting together different materials in the 16th century, drawing upon the resources of different continents. Let me move to the second part, and I'll be quick on that because I want to finish more with the patents. It's the intervention of the state to foster innovation. I've talked about how much the Venetians were striving to make new things, not just for the Ottomans, also for European markets. By the 15th century, many states are deciding to intervene and support the arrival of new technicians and the production of new things. This is, you recognize, if you've been there, is the main square, Piazza del Campo in Siena. Here is the Sienese government, 1459, that creates a college, so a state committee of 18 citizens on crafts. And they said, considering the great utility that every republic draws from having an abundance of trades and skills in its city, by means of which the poor men find work and earnings, and goods are obtained at the best price, the city becomes more populated and in the end wealthy, because foreign money comes in and its own money does not go out. So it's what economic historians would call a mercantilistic definition that you can find in the 17th, 18th century very easily. We need to produce ourselves the best things instead of importing them. And you do it by attracting technicians to the city to create objects that you were not able to do before. The same, and even more clearly stated, is decided by Luca in 1544, but I'm not staying on that. Here, I'll be very quick. If you want to get a craftsman and you want to establish him in your city or her, in many cases were women, you have to give these people a lot of benefits, fiscal benefits, a house for free, and so on. This is a set that I, took from many. This is the way in which crafts moved from one city to another, mostly in the Renaissance and until the 17th and 18th century. There was the creation at this point of a lot of state manufacturers. So the states running luxury production directly. This is the case of Ferrara. This is the castle of Ferrara where the state manufacture was established. Mantua, you can see on the right the castle of San Giorgio in Mantua. There again, a state manufacturer for making high quality silk, high quality soap, and many other products, not just for the court, but also for the market. But the most important state manufacturer was in Florence. This is, I don't know if you ever seen this face. This is the Duke and then Grand Duke of Florence, Cosimo I, the Medici. 16th century, he comes to power in the 1530s. He was very fond of making things himself. You find for the first time princes that are interested in making things. The Ottomans were at least a bit interested. Both the conqueror of Constantinople, Mehmed II, and Suleiman the Magnificent were jewelers by training. They'd been trained even as princes, as jewelers, so they knew how to work with their hands. Cosimo was interested in making things together with the artisans, and he started paying artisans to work for him. His two sons, especially the one on the left, Francesco I, were even more, the first was practically spending more time with the artisans in the shops than running the state. The second, Ferdinand, who was a cardinal, he became the duke when the brother died. They started creating state manufacture. Francesco, for instance, tried to imitate Chinese porcelain. Porcelain, the Europeans were mystified by these wonderful objects, translucent, resistant, they thought, they had this idea that they would even discover poison. If you were, poison, you could use porcelain in order to see if somebody was poisoning you, just dropping the liquid or into porcelain. And poisoning was a very common thing in the Renaissance, so they had a very good reason for that. Francesco I started making himself with his own hands, trying to make copies of Chinese porcelain, but they didn't know about the raw materials needed. So it was a secret kept by the Chinese for many, many centuries. So he made what is soft-based porcelain, and this is made by himself and just given as a gift to other princes and monarchs in Europe. There is a cultural fascination about this object, and also you have to think that Florence was not a big state, was not powerful, or as powerful as Spain or France or England in the 16th century. You couldn't imagine the King of Spain or the King of France working in the shop with the artisans. If you are a small state, you want to have a cultural value recognized, which is through art, but also through the capability of making objects that are appreciated around Europe. Their brother Ferdinando, who came to power in 1588, was more interested in other things, so he appointed the man as the supervisor of all the manufacturers of Florence. I have to think they put together in different shops, but in the same place, more than 20 different artisans, specialists in jewelry, in making many different things. And they put them at the Uffizi. So when you see the Uffizi, which is a museum that was created as the seat of many of the offices of the state of Florence, but at the top floor, there were the workshops of the state manufacturer. And there are productions that are typical of Florence. Have you ever seen, this is the top of a table. Have you ever seen some of these tables? It's made with, what can you guess? No, it's a good guess, but the porcelain would be, most of the porcelain that was imported into Europe from China was white, blue and white, like the one that Francesco tried to imitate. You know when the secret of porcelain was discovered in Europe? It's in the early 18th century. It's an alchemist who's looking for other things. He tries to sell this secret of transforming base metals into gold to the Duke of Saxony in Dresden. And the Duke of Saxony said, okay, you stay here, almost in jail, until you really transform lead into gold. And by doing other experimentation, he was able to find the secret of porcelain. So totally by chance. But until that time, porcelain in Europe was not. This is hard stones. These are hard stones. I'll show you other examples. It becomes more and more refined with the passing of time. You can see that. The point is to cut a very thin slice of a type of stone of the right color in order to make these beautiful things on the top of tables. This is a painting practically that is made with this stone. If you want to look at the technique, it's a very old technique. You can go, there's the Museo delle Pietre Dure. In Florence, it's just, I think, not far from here, a few minutes from here. There's a small, beautiful museum in which you have an example of all these works over time. And if you look there's a back garden, there are still big masses of stones. Some of them were taken from all over the world because the Medici imported these stones from Asia, from America, from Africa, because they needed all the shades of different colors. And they are still the original, some of the stones are still the original that were taken to Florence at the time. So it became a specialty. If you go to San Lorenzo, which is just around the corner, right? The Church of San Lorenzo, there's the Chapel of the Medici, which is, the massive example of hard stones that are typical of the court of the Medici. Other examples of state manufactures, in this case it didn't work out. This is an image of a pope in Rome. It's Sixtus V, 1590, 1595. What was the idea of Sixtus V? He wanted to boost the woolen cloth industry of Rome. So he was passing through a building. This is the plan of the building one day. And he said, I'd like to transform this building, very old, into a big factory for wool making. Can you guess which building is in Rome, this one? It's a very famous one. It's a building in which there were games, some very cruel games. It's the Colosseum. So this is the plan made by the architect of the Pope. They started working. They were transforming it into a big silk factory. Wool cloth factory. So the point is that the Pope died suddenly in 1595 and they stopped. Otherwise, you wouldn't see a very different Colosseum in Rome, not what is standing today. But just to give you an idea, and I insist on this, and it's probably something strange for Americans as it is for English people, that the idea of many economic historians is that innovation comes through private enterprise, market competition, and so on, which is true to a certain extent, of course. In this period, however, for the whole of the Renaissance, and still in the 18th century, apart from England, that is, they had the Industrial Revolution in a particular way, most of the innovation comes also with the support of the state, because you need a lot of money to experiment and to make mistakes until you make the right thing. So this is a point that I like to make. The point that brings me to the last topic, to patents. The state supporting innovation through a legal system that allows you to register an innovation. One of the first examples of patents, they were not called patents, they were called privileges at the time, but the structure is more or less the same. It's again coming from Florence, and the man that you can see on the left is Filippo Brunelleschi. Anybody knows about Filippo Brunelleschi? He's the great architect of the Dome of Florence. He's also the inventor of perspective. So it's quite a central character in the history of the Renaissance. When they were building the top of the dome, the top of the church, we're talking about the 1410s, 1420s, the problem they had is that, marble comes from the mountains at the north of Florence, like the Alps, where's the Carrara, so from the north of Tuscany. And they had to be carried from the mountains, the big blocks of marble, to the Arno River, to be then embarked into a barge and then disembarked. And in this case, it was very, difficult. So what Brunelleschi presented to the government is a new type of barge that is amphibious. They can go into the water and on land to carry the marble to the construction, for the construction of the Dome of Florence. The government gave him a patent for a certain number of years with exclusive right to use this barge on the Arno. Unfortunately, the barge didn't work. He lost a lot of marble, so he had to repay the government a lot of money. But this is one of the first examples that is connected with the creation, for the first time after antiquity, of a dome that is as big or bigger than the Pantheon. So it's a new achievement for the Italians. People looking at the dome, have you been to the hills? You see the dome from everywhere, of course. And technically, he invented many different things in order to make this architectural achievement. This is an imagined reconstruction of the barge, that the Badalone, as it was called. Then we come to Venice again. 1474, just a few years after printing from Germany had arrived in Venice, with the great success of this new industry, for the first time in history, a government says, okay, this is Venetian. It's not so difficult to read, but it's well written. It's the Venetian Senate. And this says, the city is so rich, so full of people coming from all over the world, arriving with new ideas, that if we protect them, we give them some protection for their inventions, that nobody can copy what they present, they would bring even more ideas and inventions. So, by decree of the government, everybody could go to a state office in the center of Venice and register a patent, practically, a new invention. And he will or she will have 10 years of monopoly rights on that. And I don't know if you recognize, this is a beautiful, this is just a small detail of one of the biggest maps ever made in the Renaissance. Is a map of Venice made in the year 1500 by Jacopo de Barbari. You see the big bridge on the canal here in the center. You can imagine which bridge is that. We've seen it before in another slide, but in a later version. So this is the Rialto Bridge as it was. You have the Rialto Bridge that you see was made in stone only in the late 16th century. The Rialto Bridge was made of wood and it would open in the center to let ships go through the Grand Canal. If you step down the Rialto Bridge on the side of the market, you look where there is the square pavement there was the first patent office in history. We have Leonardo da Vinci coming to Venice and say, I've been to see the office full of models, because people, inventors, would bring their own models to leave the models with their name, so that if somebody else would present a similar invention, they would claim to have been the first and stop the granting of a patent. There are inventions of the 16th century they are still using daily, probably. This is a type character. What can you recognize? You use it probably with Word every day. How do you call it? When you have to quote the title of a book in a paper, I don't know if you do it, but I imagine you do it. What do you use? Not the bold character. You put it in italics in many cases. This is an invention that was patented by a printer in Venice in the early 16th century. Is the italics type that we are still using. This new system of giving patents spreads very quickly, first in Italy, then in the rest of Europe. By the middle of the 16th century, all the governments are using the same system to grant these patents because they want to have new technology, new techniques, new objects. Back again to Florence. This is the main architect of Florence under Francesco I, the Medici dukes that we have seen before, Bernardo Buontalenti. Being an inventor also, he invents 3 machines. This is the front page of an account book that is here in the State Archives of Florence. And he lists the 42 states in which he has presented his inventions, requesting a patent. So we start with the Sommo Pontefice is the Pope, because the Pope was giving a lot of patents. The Emperor, the Holy Roman Emperor, the King of Spain, Portugal, France, England, should have said the Queen of England, because it was Queen Elizabeth in power at the time. The King of Poland, the Grand Duke of Tuscany, of course, Savoy, Bavaria, the states of Italy, Venice, other German states, Saxony, Brandenburg, Milan, Sicily, the viceroyalties of Spain, until it goes all the way to the great master of the religion of Malta. So the system was so widespread in Europe that you can really patent something. Of course, not in 42 states, unless you are the architect of the Grand Dukes, so you can mobilize the diplomacy of the Medici in order to support your patent. But you can see that practically it becomes a legal system that is recognized all over Europe. Of course, if you have a patent in Spain, anybody could copy you in France. If you have a patent in England, everybody could copy you in Poland or in other parts of Europe. So he wanted to have the whole of Europe in his hands, making partnerships, having agents in each city in order to exploit the new invention. Inventions came in all kinds. This is another strange kind of mill exploded that is visible in the archives of Florence. Machines for dredging canals. We know they were very successful in Venice. Machines for working woolen cloth. So a lot of mechanization is going on thanks to the patents for inventions. Then you start having advertisement. How do you say Americans in American advertisement? Okay. So leaflets that are given around in markets advertising a new invention. I'm not reading the text, but they are advertising new types of implements. The guy on the right has invented a new machine that could sow the seeds instead of just plant the seeds. So you pass with the machine and the machine plants each seed deep down on the ground instead of just sowing it. At the time, it was very important because, you know, birds would eat great part of the seeds or they could be dispersed. So he invented this new machine and was advertising. Treatises, how to do manuals on how to use the machines were published in the 16th century. One of the dreams that Europeans had was how to go underwater for a long time. So you can see that there are publications in the 16th century that are like deep divers, but they didn't work at the time. That's quite imaginative. Some of these were developed, however, in Venice when there was a big problem with the shipwreck of a big galleon, the shipwreck at the mouth of the harbor. The Venetians created this big machine in order to recover. I'm not going into the explanation because it's based on the principle of Archimedes. There are two big boxes at the side. You position the big machine on top of the ship. Then you fill with water the two boxes. You attach the ship, they go to the bottom of the sea. You attach the ship to the machine, then you pump out the water, and then they should come up together with the ship. It didn't work. You can see the size of this immense machine made by the Venetian state, and it crashed on top of the ship, and so the Venetians had the harbor stopped by the ship and the machine. So it was a big disaster, but that didn't stop. And these are the diving bells used by the divers to go down 20 meters. These are patented, and we have still the drawings. I'm showing this before ending, this image, that it's not understandable, of course, to give you an example of a woman that patented something. This is the first woman, 1501, that is patenting something with the Venetian government. Her name is Cornelia. She's the wife of a soldier paid by the Republic. And she says, I'm a big inventor. As you know, I've made a lot of fake jewels made with glass that looks like real jewels. Now I invented pearls made with glass or other materials that look like real pearls. May I have a patent for that? And the government, probably she had a very good, references, and she was known in the city. They gave her a patent for 10 years in 1501. She was not lucky because these pearls were so good that everybody was buying and selling them. So that could be a problem for the Venetians because if international merchants coming to Venice, Venice was one of the great markets for real pearls, could be confused about are they real, are they not. They wanted really to have real pearls. So they stopped, and you see the lines canceling the privilege for the poor woman. So these are, also the publication of coffee table books with machines. It's another passion of the 16th century. So the passion for these new things, you can see on the right, a machine for consulting many books at the same time. So it's a wheel that you turn, and it keeps the book always at the right position, and you can consult 5, 10 different books if you are a scholar, if you want. I finish briefly with a series of engravings made in Florence in the 1580s that gives you an idea about the change of mentality, because my main point is all this evolution by the state, by private individuals, by connections with other parts of the world, not just with Europe, changed the mentality of Europeans. For the first time, you have the idea that, okay, the ancients were good, but we are actually better. And we are in a new path to modernity. There's a series of engravings that's called Nova Reperta, the new findings. It was engraved by the Flemish artist, commissioned here in Florence, 1580s, commissioned by a Florentine rich nobleman. And it shows the inventions that had been discovered after the classical times, things that the Greeks, the Romans didn't know, and they had been discovered through the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. This one is very easy. What is this? A printing press. When is invented? Gutenberg is a name familiar, Germany. 18? 14? Yeah, no, yes, it's 1455, 58. No, it's the correct date. This is another invention of the late 13th century, very useful. And we are wearing, many of us are wearing it. It's eyeglasses. Eyeglasses. And Florence, again, together with Venice, was the center for the production of glasses in many different gradations. So that's the point. They were able to make glasses according to your problem. Things, we have a preacher saying this has just been invented in Italy, is a man from Pisa, in the 1290s, in the late 13th century, when the Lucchese were imitating, the silks from China. It's interesting because it's not helping only scholars, because you can read until you are old, and some of us, even young people, need correction to the view. But think about an artisan or a goldsmith or somebody who has to work with precision with his hands and could not do it because he's my age or he's 55 or he's 70, and he would be without social security and without the possibility of supporting himself or herself. Think about an embroiderer, for instance. So this is a big invention from many points of view, culturally, but also economically and socially. Another invention of the Middle Ages, of the 14th century, the mechanical clock. So we are not using sundials or other systems to calculate time. And you have to think that throughout Europe, you have the spread of public clocks, put on towers, on bell towers. There's a famous French historian who said the starting of time calculating not with the hours of the church, but with the hours of the merchant. And this is the summary, the final engraving of the series, and I conclude with this, of the Nova Reperta. I haven't shown you all the inventions that are included, like gunpowder and artillery, which is a new thing, again, of the late Middle Ages. You see the printing press under the name of Nova Reperta. You see distillation, which was found by the Arabs. Many of these inventions are not European. Many come from Asia, from China, and are adopted by the Europeans. Here you have a tree, guaiacum, that comes from America, and it's supposed to cure syphilis, which is a new disease coming from the New World. The stirrup with the saddle, something that the Romans didn't know, allows you to charge, to be a very heavy warrior on top of a horse. Silk, you can see the cocoons on the left, the clock, and especially you have two characters. An old man going out of the picture, that's old knowledge. These are the ancients. And a woman, it's quite interesting, a young woman coming in, pointing to the discovery of America. And you know America, why America is called America. You should know why America is called America. From Amerigo Vespucci was a Florentine that was the first who sent a letter describing this new continent. So the first person who made a map with America well delineated, what they knew at the time, took the name from the author of this letter and called America from Amerigo Vespucci. Another Florentine glory. I know there's a company I found that they are like a sort of group of honor of Amerigo Vespucci, and they took turns in his tomb, which is in a church in Florence, to stand in front of the tomb the whole day for 365 days a year, which is totally mad, in my opinion, but they do it. In any case, the other thing that you see on the other side is the maritime compass, the marine compass, something that allows you to navigate the oceans. That is the big development, of course, of the 16th century. The Spaniards going to America, the Portuguese going all the way to India, into Asia, across Africa, around Africa, not across Africa. So this gives you the idea, very briefly, in a summary, of a changed mentality. So the ancients didn't know a lot of things that we know now. The discovery of new continents was important, of course, for this change of mentality. But together with patents, together with this fixation on innovation, I mean, I cannot insist so much, but if you look at all the papers of people, of especially the elites in Europe, throughout Europe, they want new things. They want to be surprised. They have to have new objects. The French market, for instance, the Italian says, you don't need to make silk cloth very resistant, because the French, after a year, they don't want it with the same patterns anymore. They want a new thing. So make it light, they buy it, and they change it. In the 17th century, you start to have the early fashion, for instance, with designers that are prepared in Lyon, in France, to create new drawings for the textiles, as we have twice a year, I think, the change of fashion, right? Nowadays, the launches of new fashion. But it's really one of the beginning, not only of consumerism, but also of this technological mentality of the West. And what is interesting, you don't find the same legal system for patents, for instance. You find a lot of innovations in the rest of the world, but you have to wait until the 19th century, really, before other parts of the world, not the Western part, America included, of course, took up this idea of granting patents. Nowadays, there are problems with patents. Many people would say they stifle innovation, because the fights between Microsoft and Samsung or other big multinationals, actually they're patenting so many things just to stop others from innovating. It has changed a bit, but it's one of the driving forces. So my Renaissance is still made of big paintings, wonderful buildings, but it's really something that changes the mentality throughout Europe. It's not just an Italian thing, throughout Europe, of Europeans. So the path to modernity, and they call themselves by the 17th century the moderns, as opposed to the ancients, starts really with the 15th century, with this idea of starting new technologies, new industries with patents, with the help of the state, in collaboration, of course, with merchants, technicians, and I think I can stop here. Thank you very much.
I think we have time for one question. Anyone has a question? No one? Yes.
So you talked about natural dyeing with silk, and in America, when I took my class on natural dye, we dyed with like the insect cochineal, and we had to have that like extracted and shipped to America. And I was just wondering, like, if you're having this insect shipped from like Asia or something, how that worked back then, and how the insect like survived in Venice, and just natural dyes in general.
Thank you. No, they couldn't survive really the travel. There's a myth about silk that there were 2 monks, and then I reply to your question on dyes, that silk was brought to the Byzantine because the Romans were buying loads of silk from China, but they didn't know even where China precisely was. They were, intermediaries bringing the silk all the way through Asia to the Mediterranean. The Romans were spending millions of their money for buying silks. And they said they come from the land of Ceres, that's a mythical land way out in the east. And they were not able to make it because they didn't have the silkworm that makes, the cocoons from which you make silk. The legend wants, that's one of the images of the Nova Reperta that I showed you. Yeah, it's about this. 2 monks were able to smuggle. They went to China in the 6th century, and they were able to smuggle some of the eggs of the silkworms into canes. And they brought them all the way to Constantinople. There are suspects about the possibility of having them surviving for, takes 200, 300 days probably, traveling by land. So what the Venetians or the Italians, the Europeans did, even from cochineal from America, when they started importing it in the 1540s massively, from Spain, the ships were coming. The first thing that they brought, there were fleets of ships coming every year from Veracruz in Mexico, collecting all the things that they had produced in America. There was silver, gold, especially, pearls. I just finished yesterday a chapter on a book I'm writing with friends on pearls, in the history of pearls in the medieval, early modern world. And the third product was cochineal. Masses of cochineal. But the insects are killed, are dried where they are collected, and then they are either crushed and made into a paste, And there, the Spaniards and the Native Americans were cheating a bit. So the Europeans were suspicious that they put a lot of stuff inside, red stuff. So they had to be careful with what they bought. In the case of the other insects, it could come also as dried insects. So you find in the documents, I'm just finishing a piece in English on this story because it's much more complicated than that. There is also an Armenian technician that is called to Luca to learn how to teach the Lukis at the same time how to dye with that technique. But in any case, they distinguish between the dye that comes as a paste and the dye that comes as, they say, vermini, as worms, but dried insects that are then crushed and made into a paste in Europe. Yes, no, it would have been. The son of the person making the petition, the young guy who went all the way to Persia to learn, he is bringing back 1 ton of this new dye, which is an immense amount. I found out who were the merchants paying for it to support the network, because he didn't go just on his own. And there's a lady, there's a French woman who's it's a best expert of dyeing in Europe. She actually goes around the Mediterranean infesting trees with the parasites that have disappeared just to have this dye like it was in the Middle Ages, which I don't know if it's a good thing to do, but she goes around. And it's talking about, I don't remember how many million insects you need to have a ton of the material. I think you need 40 insects for a gram. So you can imagine for a ton how many insects. And they were growing, they were living in very low vegetation in Caucasus, in Azerbaijan. They found also in Poland after it became popular, just beneath the ground, on the roots. So you can imagine the work to collect millions and millions of these insects. That's why the price was very high. That's why the color and everything connected with this dye was impressive. But for a long time, when cochineal from Mexico arrived, the Italians were suspecting it was the same, it was an insect, like in but it took 2 centuries for the Europeans to know precisely. The Spaniards were quite secret on that, to know precisely that it came from an insect. Because when you see it as a paste, it's difficult to judge. It was difficult at least. But it's a fascinating story for me at least.
I have a question, Luca. Very, very short answer, if you can. So, talking about public history is one of the most interesting kind of topics now discussed among historians. Can you tell us about you were talking about global material, global world, commerce and culture. So, what kind of life was spent by someone who was trading from the east to the west? Let's say in the life, what was an everyday life, for someone who was, embracing the idea of commercing this stuff from the east to the west. So he woke up, then what did he decide at that time, What kind of risks he, had?
We are working with 3 colleagues. One is here at the Institute, and it was a colleague in Warwick, who was the director of the Global Center, Giorgio Riello, who is Italian, and then Paula Finland, she's a professor at Stanford, on the world at the end of the 16th century, because we have this wonderful travel narrative of a Florentine, again, Francesco Carletti, who left from Florence. He went to work in Spain, and then he started using the Spanish and the Portuguese ships and fleets to travel around the world. He was the first Italian after Pigafetta, who was with Magellan, to do the tour of the world. And he left a wonderful description of, Mexico, of Lima in Peru, of Japan, of China, of India. And it's full of risks, first of all, because, there's a famous merchant manual, the most famous of the merchant manual of all times, I think, by a Florentine, again, Francesco Pegolotti, who was written around the 1340s. It's here at the Capiana. his capital the Riccariana, and he starts this manual in which he tells you about all the weights and measures and what to do to trade in different parts of the world, with how to travel from Genoa or Venice and reach Beijing, Katai, as it was called, China, in 280 days. And he explains all the stops, what you have to do, and what you have to bring, how you should wear, and you have to take, the boat, the ship from Venice or Genoa to Constantinople, then to the Black Sea, and then you start horses, camels, barges to cross rivers. You have to cross the Pamir Mountains. You have to cross. It's incredible. So, and these people could come and go 2 or 3 times. We have documentation. They went back. Imagine that if you send a letter, and there was a community of Italian merchants, tombstones from the 14th century have been found in China on the restoration. If you send a letter from China to your parents, relatives in Venice or Genoa, it takes more or less a year, if you're lucky, if it arrives. Then there's a letter that is wonderful. There's a merchant in Genoa. His partner was there in China with him, and he says he died. I have all his goods, all his money, and he's writing to the relatives and say, you are the inheritors. What do you want me to do? To ship the money back to Genoa or to keep them invested in business? We know it because we know the story because they went in front of a notary and they wrote a document and said, no, keep them there and invest them again. So the notary wrote the document, sent the document back to China. It took another year at least, let's say 3 years altogether. So you can imagine, the same is true between, the Spanish governors of Mexico or Peru. They might ask for something to the Spanish king and the reply comes a year after. It's not WhatsApp. Or, we are so used to instant communication, which is a magic throughout the world, that we don't realize that in the meantime, people have died, there had been a revolt, everything can happen. So when you read the communication among merchants over long distances, it's wonderful because somebody is asking something, and when the letter arrives and you have both sets of letters, the guy says, no, but I have already sent the thing in the other city, or no, the caravan has not arrived. There are all kinds of difficulties. So the life is tough. You need to be young, and they were young. You need to travel in group, possibly, not alone, but we have travel narratives of the 16th century. These people really were incredible. The English travelers, or the Spanish, the Portuguese travelers, not just the Italians, of course. There were jewelers that went for jewels all the way to Myanmar, it was Cambodia in the past. And they are faced with new civilizations, new type of, in many cases, there's the difficulty to cross for a Christian, Muslim worlds. In any case, the best narrative of travel, one of the best, is from an Arab person, Ibn Battuta, who wrote his travels in the 14th century. He left from Morocco, and he went throughout the world because he arrived in China and back, describing it's a very long, dense narrative, but it's wonderful because it explains everything that happens in different parts of the world in the 14th century. So you have these stories that are fascinating when they are describing the day by day. Many died. As you have to think that for the 16th and 17th century, 40–50% of the people on board the ships going from Portugal to India or from America, they died. They died of diseases. They died in many cases because of the heat of the new types of insects that they would find. They were not used to a lot of these elements. Then there is also a dark story, because we like to think about all these people as nice travelers and nice merchants. On the side, they were trading slaves, they were doing whatever came into their hands. So it's not always such a nice story. Also for Italian merchants, there were still slave traders for a long time. So in the 14th century, there are masses of slaves from Tatar lands, from Asia, arriving into Italy. You have to imagine Florence or Venice, full of Tatars, of people coming from Tatar lands. Now there's a book that appeared just 2 weeks ago, Carlo Vecce. The guy is a professor of literature in Naples, and he pretends to have found these documents that Leonardo da Vinci was actually the son, a legitimate son of a slave from, of a Mongol slave from Asia. The documents he's presenting are not at all convincing, but it wouldn't be impossible. So what you have there, image of the Italians don't like to talk about that very much, especially economic historians, but that's a story that is quite important.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.